The small bell above the diner's door chimed every Thursday at exactly 6:15 p.m., and everyone knew who it was without looking up. The Honorable Judge M had been coming to Ray's downtown diner for so long that her routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Her silver hair was always neatly pinned back, and she carried the same worn leather briefcase her father had given her when she graduated law school 30 years ago. The smell of fresh coffee and homemade apple pie filled the air as she made her way to her usual corner booth. The vinyl seats had small cracks from years of use, but to her, they were more comfortable than any fancy restaurant chair. "The usual, Your Honor," old Ray would call out from behind the counter, already reaching for her favorite blue and white coffee mug. What most people didn't know was that this small-town diner was her escape from the weight of her federal judge's robes. In the courthouse, she dealt with hardened criminals, complex cases, and the heavy responsibility of maintaining justice. But here, surrounded by the gentle clinking of forks against plates and the quiet conversations of locals, she could just be herself. Ray's wife, Mrs. Chen, would always sneak an extra slice of pie onto the judge's plate, saying, "You're too skinny. All that brain work needs fuel." The judge would pretend to protest, but they all knew she'd finish every last crumb. She'd sit there for hours, sometimes reading case files, sometimes just watching the world go by through the slightly smudged windows. The diner itself was like stepping back in time. The checkered floor tiles had been there since the 1960s, and the jukebox in the corner still played vinyl records. The walls were covered with old photographs of the town and its people, graduations, weddings, and local baseball team victories. Among them was a faded picture of Ray's father opening the diner's doors for the first time. Regular customers would stop by her booth to chat, sharing town gossip or asking for advice about their kids getting traffic tickets. She listened to everyone with the same attention she gave to courtroom cases, offering kind words and gentle wisdom. To the townspeople, she wasn't just a federal judge. She was part of their extended family. What nobody realized was that this peaceful routine was about to be shattered. The first signs were subtle. Nervous glances from the staff when certain customers walked in, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when anyone got too close. Ray's shoulders seemed to carry more tension each week, and his usually cheerful wife's smile became strained. The judge noticed everything but said nothing. Years on the bench had taught her to observe, to wait, to gather information before acting. She saw the way Ray's hands trembled slightly when a group of motorcycles rumbled past the diner. She noticed how some of the regular evening customers had stopped coming in altogether. At first, it seemed like the typical ebb and flow of small-town life. But there was something different about this change, something that made her instincts, honed by years of dealing with criminals, tingle with warning. She started bringing different case files with her, ones involving local gang activity and organized crime. As she sat in her booth that Thursday evening, sipping her coffee and pretending to read the local newspaper, the trouble started small, like most big problems do. First, it was just the occasional motorcycle parked outside Ray's diner, nothing unusual for a place right off the highway. But then one bike became 3, then 5, then a whole row of gleaming machines that seemed to grow longer each week. They belonged to the Steel Serpents, a gang that had been slowly spreading its influence through small towns across the state. The locals started whispering about changes in other businesses downtown. The flower shop suddenly had new partners. The hardware store mysteriously closed early most days. Even the old barber shop, which had been around longer than the diner, put up a for sale sign overnight. Everyone knew why, but nobody dared say it out loud. Ray tried to keep things normal at first. He'd serve anyone who came in, biker or not, with the same friendly smile he gave everybody else. But even Judge M could see the strain in his eyes when the leather-clad customers lingered too long, speaking in low voices near the kitchen door. Mrs. Chen stopped coming out to serve customers, staying in the back where she felt safer. One quiet afternoon, Judge M overheard 2 elderly regulars talking about how the bike shop down the street was now paying for protection. They quickly went silent when they noticed her nearby, but she had heard enough. It was the same pattern she'd seen in dozens of cases that had come through her courtroom. Small businesses being squeezed dry by gangs who acted like they were offering a service. The diner's regular customers started dwindling. The morning coffee crowd got smaller, and the lunch rush became more of a trickle. The booths that used to be filled with families were now often occupied by men in leather vests, their patches showing their gang allegiance. They'd never caused trouble, not exactly, but their presence was enough to make others stay away. Ray started looking older by the day. His hand shook more when he poured coffee, and dark circles appeared under his eyes. Judge M watched as he had whispered conversations with his teenage son, probably telling him to stay away from the diner after school. The boy used to help out with dishes, but now he was nowhere to be seen. The breaking point came when Ray tried to fix the prices on his menu. For 30 years, he'd kept his prices fair, making sure everyone in town could afford a hot meal. But now he was being forced to raise them, and everyone knew it wasn't because of inflation. The gang wanted their cut, and they didn't care if it meant longtime customers couldn't afford their daily coffee anymore. Local law enforcement seemed helpless. The few times police cars drove by, the bikers would act like perfect customers, leaving generous tips and calling Ray sir. But as soon as the patrol cars turned the corner, the intimidation would start again. It was subtle. A comment here, a long stare there, but effective. Judge M started bringing different newspapers to her evening visits. Instead of just the local paper, she now had ones from neighboring counties. Each one told similar stories. Businesses closing, neighborhoods changing, and the Steel Serpent's territory growing. She made notes in her small black notebook, connecting dots that others might miss. The air in the diner grew heavier with each passing day. Regular customers who still came in spoke in whispers, and the jukebox played less often. The cheerful clinking of plates and chatter of voices was replaced by the rumble of motorcycles and the heavy thud of boots on linoleum. Something had to give, and soon. What nobody knew was that Judge M wasn't just watching anymore. She was planning. And when the Steel Serpents finally made their big move, they'd learn why crossing paths with this particular judge would be their biggest mistake. Thursday evening rolled around again, but something felt different in the air. The usual peaceful sunset that painted Ray's diner in warm orange light was interrupted by dark clouds gathering overhead. The judge sat in her corner booth, pretending to read her newspaper while keeping one eye on the door. Her coffee had gone cold, forgotten as she watched the street outside grow darker. The first rumble of motorcycles came just after 7 p.m. Not the usual one or two bikes, but a whole pack of them, their engines deliberately loud enough to rattle the diner's windows. The few remaining customers glanced nervously at each other. An elderly couple quickly asked for their check, leaving their half-eaten meals behind. 5 members of the Steel Serpents walked in, their boots heavy on the checkered floor. The leader was a mountain of a man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. Behind him, his followers spread out like they owned the place. The bell above the door gave one last weak chime before falling silent. Ray stood behind the counter, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. His wife had frozen in the kitchen doorway, a pot of fresh coffee forgotten in her hands. The judge noticed how the couple's teenage daughter, who sometimes helped with weekend shifts, quietly slipped into the back room. "Smart girl." "Evening, folks," the gang leader called out, his voice carrying a fake friendliness that fooled no one. He walked up to the counter, purposely bumping into chairs along the way. "Thought it was time we had a proper chat about business, Ray." The judge carefully folded her newspaper, laying it aside without making the sound. She'd seen this scene play out in countless victim testimonies in her courtroom. But this time, she wasn't behind her bench. She was right here, watching it unfold in real time. The remaining customers seemed to shrink in their seats, trying to become invisible. A young mother pulled her child closer, shielding him from view. The cook peeked out from the kitchen window, then quickly disappeared again. The usually noisy diner had become so quiet you could hear the coffee maker dripping in the background. "I told you before," Ray said, his voice shaking but determined. "This is a family business. We're not interested in any partnerships." His wife had moved closer to him, her hand finding his arm in silent support. The gang leader's fake smile vanished. He leaned over the counter, getting right in Ray's face. "Maybe you're not understanding me clearly. This isn't about what you want anymore. This is about what's going to happen." Two of his men moved toward the kitchen, while another stood by the door. The fourth started slowly walking between the tables, making sure everyone got a good look at the patches on his leather vest. The message was clear. No one was leaving until this business was settled. What they didn't notice was the judge's hand slowly reaching down beside her booth. Years ago, the Federal Marshal Service had installed a silent alarm button there, disguised as part of the seat's padding. It was meant for her protection, but tonight it would serve a bigger purpose. She watched as one of the gang members flipped the diner's open sign to closed. Another pulled down the window blinds. They were getting ready to make their point, probably thinking they had all the time in the world. They had no idea that help was already on the way, or that they'd just walked into one of the biggest mistakes of their lives. The judge took a slow sip of her cold coffee, mentally counting down the minutes. She knew exactly how long it would take for the first responders to arrive. All she had to do was keep things from getting out of hand until then. And after 30 years on the bench, she knew a thing or two about handling tough situations. The confrontation was building like a summer storm, and the judge knew timing would be everything. She watched as the gang leader grabbed Ray's collar, bunching up the clean white fabric of his work shirt. That was the moment she chose to act. With calm dignity earned from decades on the bench, she stood up. The sound of her coffee cup being deliberately set down echoed in the tense silence. Every head turned toward her corner booth. She straightened her jacket, the same way she did before entering her courtroom, and stepped into the aisle. "I believe," she said, her voice clear and steady, "you gentlemen are making this serious mistake." The gang leader's grip on Ray's collar loosened slightly as he turned to face this unexpected interruption. His eyes narrowed, trying to place where he'd seen her before. "Lady, this is none of your business," he growled, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. Something about her calm confidence didn't fit with the scared faces around the diner. "Actually," she continued, walking slowly toward the counter, "it very much is my business. You see, I've been coming to this diner for 15 years, longer than most of you have been riding motorcycles." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And I don't appreciate seeing good people being harassed." One of the younger gang members snickered, but the sound died in his throat when she turned to look at him. "You," she said, "were in my courtroom 3 months ago for assault. Currently on probation, if I remember correctly. And you're not supposed to be associating with known criminal elements." The color drained from his face as recognition hit him. The other gang members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of who they were dealing with. The judge turned her attention to another member. "And you, second row, third seat in the jury selection last week. You were dismissed when we discovered your connection to the Steel Serpents. Interesting to see you here now." The gang leader tried to regain control of the situation. "Listen, lady, judge or not." But she cut him off with the same authority she used to silence disruptive attorneys. "No, you listen," she said, her voice dropping lower. "I've watched you terrorize this community for weeks. I've seen good people afraid to come to their favorite diner. I've heard the stories of businesses falling under your protection. And I've read the police reports, all of them." She took another step forward, and despite being shorter than most of them, she seemed to tower over everyone in the room. "I know every pending case against your organization, every investigation, every witness statement, every plea deal in progress. And right now, you're all violating multiple laws just by standing here." The gang leader's face had turned an interesting shade of red. He opened his mouth to speak, but then the distant sound of sirens cut through the evening air. The judge allowed herself a small smile. And that would be the cavalry arriving. I pressed my panic button 5 minutes ago. The next few moments were chaos, but controlled chaos. The gang members looked to their leader, who was clearly calculating his options. The judge knew his type, all swagger until faced with real consequences. The sirens were getting louder, and now multiple sets could be heard approaching from different directions. You have exactly 30 seconds to leave this diner before those doors are blocked by every law enforcement officer in the county, she said calmly. And I promise you, after tonight, if I see any of you within a mile of this place again, I'll personally make sure you serve every single day of your maximum sentences. The gang members were already backing toward the door. Their leader made one last attempt to save face. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his heart wasn't in it. Everyone in the room knew it was very much over. The bell above the door chimed 5 times in quick succession as they rushed out. The rumble of motorcycles starting up and peeling away filled the air, competing with the approaching sirens. The judge watched through the window as the bikes disappeared just as the first police cars turned onto the street. Within minutes, Ray's Diner looked like a police convention. Red and blue lights painted the windows in alternating colors, while officers filled every corner of the small restaurant. The smell of coffee mixed with leather from police jackets as local cops, state troopers, and federal marshals gathered around the judge's usual booth, their notepads out and pens ready. The judge sat calmly, reciting details from memory like she was reading from a case file. "The leader has 3 pending cases in my court alone," she explained, stirring her fresh cup of coffee. "Drug distribution, extortion, and assault with a deadly weapon. He made bail last month." The officers nodded, scribbling frantically as she listed names, dates, and crimes. In the background, Ray and his wife were talking to a pair of detectives, their hands still shaking, but their voices growing stronger with each passing minute. Their daughter had emerged from the back room and was hugging her mother tightly. The few customers who had stayed through the ordeal were being interviewed as witnesses, each eager to tell their part of the story. "The young one by the door," the judge continued, "he's violating his probation just by wearing those gang colors. And the tall one with the tattoo on his neck skipped his court date last week." She took a sip of coffee and smiled slightly. "I make it a point to remember faces, especially when they show up in my courtroom." The chief of police, a seasoned veteran with gray at his temples, shook his head in amazement. "You've been watching them this whole time, haven't you, Your Honor?" he asked. "Every Thursday night, sitting here in your booth, you were gathering intelligence." "Sometimes," she replied, "the best view of what's really happening in our community isn't from behind the bench. It's from behind a coffee cup." Several officers chuckled at that, the tension in the room finally starting to ease. Outside, more police cars were arriving. Word had spread quickly through the law enforcement community. Nobody liked the idea of a judge being threatened, even indirectly. The Steel Serpents had managed to do something remarkable. They had united every branch of law enforcement in the county against them. Mrs. Chen appeared with a tray full of coffee cups and a plate of her famous apple pie. "On the house," she said, her voice still trembling but her smile genuine. "For everyone." The officers thanked her, and soon the diner was filled with the comfortable sounds of forks against plates and quiet conversation. The judge watched as a young officer took photos of the scene. She knew these would end up in a case file, maybe even be shown in her courtroom someday. The boot marks on the floor, the disturbed chairs, the blinds still pulled down, all evidence of what had almost happened here. "We'll need to move fast," the federal marshal said, pulling up a chair. "Hit all their known locations tonight, while they're scattered and scared. Use their probation violations as probable cause." The judge nodded, knowing that sometimes justice needed a little push to get rolling. Ray came over to the booth, wringing his hands in his apron. "I don't know how to thank you," he started, but the judge waved him off. "You've been serving me coffee and pie for 15 years, she said warmly. "Consider this my way of leaving a tip." The local news vans were starting to arrive outside, their reporters eager for a story. But the judge knew the real story wasn't about her. It was about a community standing up to bullies, about good people finding their courage, about justice being served not just in a courtroom, but in a small diner on a Thursday night. As she watched the officers coordinate their next moves, she couldn't help but smile. The Steel Serpents had made a classic mistake. They'd gotten so used to intimidating others that they'd forgotten to look carefully at who was watching them. They'd chosen the wrong diner, the wrong community, and definitely the wrong judge to mess with. The next few hours unfolded like a well-orchestrated symphony. Police cars moved silently through the darkened streets, their lights off to maintain the element of surprise. The judge watched from her booth as the command center inside Ray's diner buzzed with activity. Officers spoke in hushed tones into their radios, coordinating simultaneous raids across the county. "Target 1 secured," crackled a voice over the radio. "4 in custody." The chief made a mark on his map, spread out across the table where families usually enjoyed their breakfast. Another voice. "Target 2 clear." Found the evidence exactly where the judge said it would be. More marks on the map, more pieces falling into place. Local officers who knew every back road, and Shortcut paired up with federal marshals who had the authority to cross jurisdiction lines. They all had one goal: dismantle the Steel Serpents operation before word could spread about what had happened at the diner. Mrs. Chen kept the coffee flowing, moving quietly among the officers like a guardian angel with a coffee pot. Her husband had found his courage again, sharing everything he knew about the gang's movements, which days they met, which members seemed to be in charge, which businesses they'd already threatened. The judge's small notebook turned out to be a goldmine of information. For weeks, she'd been jotting down license plate numbers, meeting times, and snippets of overheard conversations. A judge's memory might be questioned in court, she explained to an admiring detective, but contemporary notes are excellent evidence. Outside, a light rain had started to fall, drumming softly on the diner's roof. The neon "open" sign reflected in the wet pavement, a beacon of defiance against the darkness. Curious neighbors had gathered across the street, watching the parade of law enforcement vehicles with a mixture of concern and hope. The young officer manning the radio suddenly sat up straighter. "Chief, they found the storage unit." The room fell silent. This was what they'd been waiting for, the motherlode of evidence. The judge smiled into her coffee cup. She'd noticed one of the gang members always took the same route home, passing by a particular storage facility. Little details like that had a way of becoming important. The district attorney arrived, suit slightly rumpled like he'd dressed in a hurry. He huddled with the judge and senior officers, discussing charges and warrants. "We've got them on Reiko," he said, excitement creeping into his professional tone. "With this much evidence, we can take down their entire operation." As midnight approached, the tallies kept coming in. 15 arrests, 6 properties searched, 3 clubhouses secured. The Steel Serpents were learning a hard lesson about the long arm of the law. Officers who'd felt helpless against the gang for months now moved with renewed purpose, proud to be part of something bigger than themselves. Ray's daughter had taken over the kitchen, making sandwiches for the officers who hadn't eaten since their shifts began. The smell of grilled cheese and coffee created an oddly comforting atmosphere in the midst of such serious business. Even in the middle of a major police operation, Ray's diner remained a place of warmth and hospitality. The judge stayed through it all, offering insights and signing warrants as needed. She'd spent years watching justice move slowly through the system, one case at a time. But tonight, justice had grown legs and was running at full speed. Every officer who came through the door nodded respectfully in her direction, knowing that her quiet vigilance had made this possible. A young marshal, probably on his first big operation, summed it up best. "You know what's amazing?" he said to his partner. "All this started because they didn't look closely enough at a lady having coffee in a diner." His partner smiled and replied, "Sometimes the biggest mistakes look just like ordinary moments until they're not ordinary anymore." The morning newspapers hit the stands with headlines that made the whole town stop and stare. Jodigi's die show diawon LED dist to GANG take diawan, read the front page, accompanied by a photo of police cars surrounding Ray's diner. The story spread like wildfire through the community, growing more incredible with each retelling. Inside her courtroom the next day, the judge maintained her usual professional demeanor as she faced a parade of Steel Serpents members in handcuffs. The gang's tough guy image had melted away in the harsh fluorescent lights of the justice system. Their leather vests and chains had been replaced by orange jumpsuits, and their arrogant smirks were nowhere to be seen. The gang leader, who had seemed so intimidating in the diner, now looked small behind the defendant's table. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear as the charges were read. Racketeering, extortion, assault, criminal conspiracy. The list went on. The evidence gathered during the night's raids had opened a floodgate of charges. In the gallery, Ray and his wife sat watching the proceedings. They'd closed the diner for the morning to be here, wanting to see justice in action. Other business owners from downtown filled the benches behind them, each with their own story of intimidation and fear. Now they watched with satisfaction as their tormentors faced the consequences of their actions. The district attorney's office was working overtime, processing cases and interviewing witnesses. People who had been too scared to speak up before were now coming forward with their stories. The wall of silence that had protected the Steel Serpents for so long was crumbling, one testimony at a time. Out in the courthouse hallway, local reporters huddled around the police chief as he explained how one judge's observations had led to the biggest gang bust in the county's history. She turned her regular coffee breaks into an intelligence-gathering operation, he said, shaking his head in admiration. While they thought they were watching us, she was watching them. Back at the diner, business was booming. People who hadn't visited in months were returning, drawn by both curiosity and a desire to show support. The booth where the judge usually sat had become something of a local attraction. Customers would point it out to their children, telling them the story of how justice was served along with coffee and pie. Mrs. Chen had put up a small framed newspaper article on the wall, right next to the old photos of the diner's opening day. Below it, she'd written in neat handwriting, "Sometimes heroes wear judges' robes." The judge had blushed when she saw it, but didn't ask them to take it down. The ripple effects spread beyond just the Steel Serpents. Other criminal groups in neighboring counties started keeping their distance from small businesses. The message was clear. You never knew who might be watching. The simple act of a judge choosing to have her coffee in a local diner had created a shield of protection that extended far beyond its walls. Local law enforcement reported a surge in community cooperation. People felt empowered to speak up about suspicious activities, knowing they had allies in high places. The barrier of distrust between citizens and law enforcement began to crack, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Younger police officers started making it a point to drop in at local businesses, not just to check for trouble, but to build relationships. They'd learned a valuable lesson from the judge. Sometimes the best way to protect a community was to become part of it. As the judge walked into the diner for her regular Thursday evening coffee, she noticed something different. The fear that had hung in the air like a heavy cloud was gone, replaced by the warm buzz of conversation and laughter. Ray greeted her with a proud smile, and Mrs. Chen already had her coffee cup ready. Everything was back to normal, but it was a stronger normal, forged in the fire of adversity and cooled in the waters of justice. 5 years have passed since that fateful night at Ray's Diner, but the story lives on in the heart of the community. The corner booth, now officially known as the Judge's Bench, still hosts its distinguished guest every Thursday evening. Though the leather is a bit more worn and the table has a few extra scratches, it remains the most requested seat in the house. The diner itself has evolved while staying true to its roots. Ray's daughter now manages the evening shift, having learned every aspect of the business from her parents. She greets customers with the same warmth her father always did, and makes sure the coffee is just as good. The walls tell the story of the place. Photographs old and new chronicle not just a business, but a community's journey. On quiet evenings, when the rush slows down, older customers tell newer ones about the night the steel serpents made their biggest mistake. The story has been told so many times that everyone has their own favorite part. Some talk about how calm the judge remained, others about how quickly the police responded. But everyone agrees on one thing. It was the moment their community found its strength. The judge herself rarely talks about what happened. She still comes in for her coffee and pie, still reads her papers, and still watches the world go by through the diner's windows. But now she sees something different. A thriving downtown where businesses stay open late without fear, where families walk the streets after dark, where the only motorcycles belong to law-abiding citizens out for an evening ride. Ray's Diner has become a sort of unofficial landmark. Police academy trainers bring their cadets here for lunch, pointing out where everything happened while teaching them about community policing. Business schools send students to interview Ray about standing up to intimidation. High school civics classes take field trips to learn about how justice works in the real world. Mrs. Chen still insists on serving the judge herself, though her steps are a bit slower now. She always adds an extra slice of pie, saying, for strength, in case any more troublemakers come around. They both know no troublemakers would dare, but it's become their little joke, a reminder of harder times overcome. The steel serpents are nothing but a memory now. Their leader and key members served their sentences, and the gang disbanded. Some of the younger members even turned their lives around, inspired by the way justice had worked with mercy. One of them now owns a legitimate motorcycle repair shop in the next county, proving that sometimes the best endings aren't about punishment, but about change. Local businesses have created a monthly community dinner at the diner, where people from all walks of life share meals and stories. The judge attends these too, sitting quietly and watching generations mix and mingle. Children who weren't even born when it all happened now play around the booths where history was made. The diner's guest book, started right after the incident, has filled up with messages from visitors around the country. Thank you for showing us what courage looks like, reads one entry. Your story gave our town the strength to stand up to, says another. Ray keeps these books carefully preserved, each page a testament to how one small diner's stand for justice inspired others to do the same. As the sun sets on another Thursday evening, the judge sits in her booth, sipping her coffee and watching the day fade into night. The diner's windows reflect the warm light inside, creating a beacon of welcome in the growing darkness. The bell above the door chimes steadily as customers come and go, each ring a reminder that some things, like good food, strong coffee, and unwavering principles, never change. This corner of the world is a little bit safer, a little bit kinder, and a lot stronger because one person chose to have her coffee in the right place at the right time and decided to do something when others looked away. It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, and that justice, like a good cup of coffee, is best served fresh and hot, in a place where everybody knows your name.